I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that is the plainest way I know to say it without dressing it up. I was 38, a diesel mechanic who could rebuild a fuel system by feel in bad light, and somehow I still managed to let my own life come apart in slow, quiet pieces. The divorce paperwork had gone through in August with no shouting left in it, just signatures and a court clerk who looked bored. My son, Eli, had turned 15 and stopped answering my texts somewhere between school starting and the first cold rain. I could watch those little message bubbles sit there for days like nails on a workbench, lined up and untouched. Then my father's old homestead in the mountains came to me, tangled in probate language and deadlines. Keep it or sell it by spring. Those were the terms, neat and legal and clean on paper, like grief could be handled with a checkbox. I took unpaid leave from the shop after I stood in Bay 3 one morning and forgot what I was holding. It was just a wrench, nothing dramatic, but I stood there with diesel smell in my nose and a half-done service ticket clipped to the fender and felt my mind go flat, like a battery gone dead in winter. My foreman, Rick, leaned against the toolbox and watched me longer than usual. "Bo, you all right?" he asked. I said I was tired. He nodded like men do when they know you're not telling it straight but aren't going to corner you over it. "Take a little time," he said. "You're no good to anybody if you burn out on me." I laughed once and told him I wasn't built for sitting still. He looked at the wrench in my hand, then back at my face. Maybe that's the problem. 3 days later, I loaded fence staples, 2 rolls of barbed wire, a post driver, a chainsaw, and enough canned food to make the back of my truck sag. I told people I was heading to the homestead to get ahead of property taxes, clear stormfall, and see what shape the north fence was in before snow. All of that was true. None of it was the reason. The reason was smaller and harder. I didn't trust myself to be needed by anyone anymore, and that place was the last thing with my name tied to it that couldn't block my number. I left before dawn with Mutt in the passenger seat, his greying muzzle on my knee, and a stack of legal documents in a manila envelope riding shotgun under him like an accusation. The road up to the ridge had always been rough, but late October made it mean. Frost stayed in the shadows till noon. Alder branches clawed the truck doors where the track narrowed. The creek crossing had shifted 2 feet east since spring runoff, and I could still hear my father's voice in my head, telling me where to place the tires so I wouldn't sink to the axle. The homestead came into view in pieces. First the old smoke pipe, then the pitch of the roof, then the split rail section my father built when his back was already failing, and he should have hired help, but never would. The place looked smaller than memory, and bigger than I could handle alone. That was a hard combination to stand in. By the last week of October, I had settled into a routine so rigid it felt like a brace around a broken bone, up before light. Coffee on the propane burner while Mutt circled 3 times and lay by the door. Inventory list in a spiral notebook. Fence clips, chain oil, lantern fuel, feed block, nails. Walk the south line and flag broken posts. Come back, heat beans. Cut deadfall till my shoulders burned. Patch one thing, then another, until there was enough dark to justify quitting. At night, I sat by a small fire and pretended the notebook was a plan instead of a hiding place. If I kept writing tasks, I didn't have to write what hurt. If I counted staples, I didn't have to count the weeks since Eli answered me with more than one word. The first evening, I noticed the coyotes. They were far enough out that I could almost call it normal. 2 sharp yips from the draw, then a string of higher calls from the ridge to the west. Mutt lifted his head, but didn't move, ears angled, then set his chin back on his paws. I told myself they were working the lower meadow for mice and rabbits, and I believed it, because believing simple things kept the dark from getting ideas. The second night, there were more of them. Not frantic, not charging, just patient and spread wide. Voices moving in a ring I couldn't see. Wind came downhill in long, cold pulls, and each time the flames dipped, I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with weather. On the third night, I gave the pattern a name because names are how mechanics manage trouble. You identify the knock before you tear down the engine. You call the thing what it is, so it stops being fog. The Coyote ring. Big group, lean from late season, disciplined enough to hold distance and keep pressure without showing themselves. I had seen packs work livestock when I was younger, and this had that same careful intelligence under it. No lunging, no chaos, just circling arcs and pause points, as if they were measuring us by scent and flame and waiting for weakness. Mutt stood against my leg once, trembling through his shoulder blades, and I put my hand on his neck and felt how old he'd gotten while I was busy missing everything else. I built the fire larger than I needed for heat and fed it on a schedule like medicine. One thick split every 12 minutes. I checked my watch because timing steadied my hands. I set my folding chair so Mutt could tuck behind my calves and still see the tree line. "You and me," I said to him, too quiet for anyone but him to hear. He looked up with those cloudy brown eyes that had watched me through 2 apartments, 1 failed marriage, and 100 ordinary mornings. He trusted me to keep him safe because that was our arrangement from the day I picked him up as a half-starved farm pup, with one ear bent over. Trust from a dog is a straightforward thing. You either carry it or you don't. Somewhere between 9 and midnight, their calls drew closer in a way that made distance feel slippery. Not close enough to show eyeshine in firelight, but close enough that I heard footfalls in leaf litter now and then. A soft, rushing step and stop. Step and stop. Never one animal by itself. The wind shifted and brought me the rank, musky smell of canids and wet earth. I held the hatchet across my lap and stared into black timber, while my mind ran old failures like a looped tape. Eli waiting on the porch for me to come home from late shifts. Me missing ball games because someone else's truck had to be ready by morning. My father calling 3 times before I called back, and then not living long enough for the long talk we kept postponing. I wanted one simple test I could pass. Keep the fire going. Keep the dog close. Make it to dawn. The practical part of me knew what to do, and I did it without drama. I pulled the food cooler into the cab so scent stayed contained. I hung a spare lantern on a nail by the chopping block to widen the light. I checked the tie outline by the cabin wall and didn't use it because I wouldn't tether Mutt if the ring pushed in. I kept the shotgun nearby but unloaded, not as bravado, just as a line I wasn't ready to cross over a night chorus and nerves. Cold settled into the hollows around camp after midnight, and frost formed on the tarp corners in a thin white edge that caught firelight like wire. The coyotes kept moving, their cadence rising and falling, patient as weather. Near 2 in the morning, Mutt finally slept, though he did it with his back pressed against my boot and one ear half lifted. I sat awake watching sparks climb and vanish among the fir branches. The homestead sat behind me with its old beams and my father's tools lined where he left them, and for the first time I admitted that I wasn't there to decide on taxes. I was there because if I sold the place, I was afraid there'd be no map left for me at all, no work with my name on it that mattered in a human way. The coyote ring kept tracing the dark in patient loops, not attacking, not leaving, and I understood that feeling more than I wanted to. Circling the edges of a life you used to belong to. Dawn came thin and pale, the sky the colour of old tin. The calls faded with the light until only crows and the click of cooling metal remained. I stood up stiff, kicked dirt over the coals and poured the first coffee of the day while Mutt stretched and sneezed and acted for a minute, like nothing had happened. I wrote the morning list in my notebook with numb fingers. Check east gate hinge, reset corner post, cut 2 more cords before weather turned. At the bottom, without thinking, I added 1 more line in smaller print. Keep him safe tonight. Then I shut the notebook, took a swallow of coffee that tasted like smoke and pennies, and went to work. The east gate hinge was worse than I hoped and better than I feared, which was about how most things had gone in my life that year. 1 bolt had sheared clean, and the lower plate was twisted where winter ice had lifted and dropped it too many times. I braced the gate with my shoulder, cursed at it in a low, steady stream, and worked the wrench until my palm burned from the cold metal. Mutt trailed me from post to post. Not fast anymore, just faithful, stopping to sniff where deer had crossed, and then checking back like he was doing rounds with me. By the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, the frost had gone to water, and the ground gave under my boots with that soft, damp sigh you only hear in late fall. The place smelled like split pine, old leaves, wet dirt, and the mineral bite of the creek down slope. I knew every contour from growing up there, but being back as the only man on the land made it strange in a way memory hadn't prepared me for. When my dad was alive, each corner of that property meant a job and a story. This stump was where he rolled his ankle and swore for 10 minutes. That bend in the fence was where a heavy snow took 3 posts in one night. The old bench by the shed was where he sat with coffee when his lungs got bad, and still pretended he was fine. Alone, all those same places felt like tools set out for someone who never came in for shift. I worked through noon without really stopping, because motion kept the noise down in my head. I drove 2 posts on the south run, reset a stretch of wire that had gone slack, then limbed out a fir that had fallen across the mule trail. Around 1 o'clock, I stood with 1 boot on the log, sawdust clinging to my jacket, and realized I was gripping the saw with both hands long after the chain had stopped. No reason. Just standing there, listening to the engine tick while it cooled, like I was waiting for instructions from somebody who wasn't there. At the cabin, I heated beans and half a can of corn in a dented pot and ate on the porch step. Mutt took his portion and settled in the patch of sun by my knee. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I already knew what I'd see. No new message from Eli. My last text sat there from 4 days before. You still into that old mini-bike project? I found the carb kit you wanted. No answer. I typed, hope school's going okay. Deleted it. Typed, I'm up at Grandpa's place doing fence work if you want to come for a weekend. Deleted that too. Set the phone face down on the step and watched a squirrel work a cone like it was the most important job in the county. I wasn't a man who cried easily, and I took no pride in that either. Some men wear stoicism like a badge. Mine was more like scar tissue. But sitting there with cold beans in my stomach and sawdust in my cuffs, I had a moment where grief came in so plain and unceremonious it caught me off guard. Not dramatic, just a pressure under the ribs, a sense of being unclaimed in the world. Husband no more, son at arm's length, father gone, employee on leave. I had always measured myself by use. If something broke, I fixed it. If somebody needed help moving, I showed up with straps and a trailer. If a truck wouldn't start at dawn, I had the battery tested before most men had coffee. Out there, the only proof I still mattered was whether the fire caught and whether the dog slept easy. The afternoon wore down in that same rhythm of work and weather. I split another stack for the night, checked the feed shed roof for leaks, and dragged old brush away from the north line so snow load wouldn't crush the fence come January. A low grey ceiling moved in from the west, and by 4 the light had flattened to pewter. Every sound got sharper when the wind dropped, the tap of loose wire against a post, the creak over stone, the scrape of my shovel, Mutt's tags ticking as he shook out his coat. Toward dusk I walked the perimeter I'd begun calling mine for the night, a rough oval from the fire pit to the woodpile. Truck, porch, and back, as if naming boundaries could keep trouble polite. There were coyote prints in the soft ground near the lower drawer, more than a handful, overlapping, angled in patient arcs. No charge lines, no rush marks, just travel, pause, travel. I crouched and put my gloved hand beside one print. Not huge, but lean and sharp, claws cutting deep. Hungry animals move differently than full ones. I knew that from ranch calls and busted gates and dawns spent pushing strays back where they belonged. Hunger made things patient. Night came early under cloud cover. I set both lanterns, built the fire high, and kept Mutt close enough that my boot touched his hip whenever I shifted in the chair. The coyote ring started before full dark this time, a spread of calls from east to west that made the timber feel occupied from every side. They still didn't rush us. They didn't need to. Pressure does its own work. It narrows your thinking till all you can see is the next hour. "Don't borrow trouble," I said out loud, and Mutt flicked an ear like he'd heard me use that line before. "We've got wood, we've got light, we've got breakfast covered. That's enough for one night." He sighed, laid his head on my boot, and for a minute I almost believed my own speech. Sometime after midnight, the wind changed and took their scent with it. The calls spread thinner, then climbed uphill and faded, until the ridge gave me only silence and a few distant barks I could chalk up to normal movement. I stayed awake another hour, feeding the fire by habit, then rolled into my sleeping bag on the porch with Mutt tucked behind my knees. The cold found every gap in the canvas wall and every old ache in my shoulders. Sleep came in shallow pieces, the way it does when part of you refuses to stand down. Dawn should have come with chatter. That ridge always woke in layers. Chickadees first, then jays arguing, then the crows like old men at a fence line. Instead, I opened my eyes to a kind of hush that sat heavy over camp. Not eerie exactly, just complete. No wing beats, no squirrel scolding, no songbirds picking at the brush pile I'd left by the shed. Even the creek seemed farther away. The fire had burned down to a clean bed of coals, and the sky was pearl grey with a thin strip of light under the clouds. Mutt was already up, standing near the woodpile, ears relaxed, tail low but loose. He wasn't bristling. He wasn't warning. He was simply looking into the fir stand above camp, as if somebody he recognized was standing there. I watched him for a full minute, expecting the hair along his spine to lift. It never did. He gave one quiet huff, sat down, and kept watching with the calm attention he used to give my father when Dad stepped out of the shed with pocket jerky. I pulled on my jacket and boots, stepped into the cold, and noticed the woodpile first. I knew exactly how I'd stacked it the night before, because I stack everything the same way. Large rounds at the back, split pieces in front, kindling crate on the left under tarp. But now, beside the crate, 3 flat river stones sat arranged in a crossed pattern on the packed dirt, deliberate as a mark on a map. Not tumbled, not random, not dropped from any slope. One long stone laid north-south, a shorter one across its centre, and a third angled under them both like a brace. Clean, balanced, purposeful. I stood there with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth and waited for a simple explanation to show up. Wind hadn't done it. Gravity hadn't done it. Coyotes sure hadn't done it. I scanned the tree line for boot prints, prank signs, any trace of Cal or one of the boys from town deciding I needed a joke. Nothing. The soil was damp enough to hold sign, and what I saw near the stones were only my own tread marks and mutts. I set the cup down and crouched, close enough to smell the cold mineral scent off the rocks. They were smooth, creek-worn, dry on top despite the night damp, as if they'd been carried in after the dew settled. My neck prickled, but not from fear, from attention. There's a difference. Fear scatters you. Attention gathers you up and points you in one direction. I said what any sensible, sleep-deprived man with too much grief and not enough company might say to a stand of firs at first light. Morning. The word came out rough, and I laughed once at myself, short and embarrassed. Well, that's where we're at now, I muttered, introducing ourselves to timber. Mutt looked back at me, then toward the trees again, calm as church. I walked the perimeter with fresh coffee in hand, slower than usual, looking harder, at the edge of camp, where the brush thickened near the old game trail. I found impressions in the soft mud that stopped me in place. Not clear enough for plaster, not the clean textbook shapes folks pass around on bad websites, but real enough in their depth and stride to make my practical brain start arguing with itself. Broad forefoot, long heel, no claw marks, step spacing too wide for me by a good margin, and each print set just outside where my nightly circuit turned back, like whoever made them had no interest in crowding us. I followed that line for 20 yards until it bent around the clearing and disappeared into fir needles where the ground turned hard. The pattern held, perimeter, not approach. I could have called it bear if I wanted comfort, but bear tracks carry weight differently, and bears don't lay river stones in tidy crosses by a man's kindling. Back at camp, I wrote in my notebook with hands that weren't quite steady. No birds at dawn. Mutt calm, staring up a fir stand. 3 flat stones crossed by woodpile. Large prints at perimeter, bipedal stride, no incursion. Then I stared at the page for a long moment and added one more line beneath it. Whatever this is, it keeps choosing distance. I closed the notebook, slid it into the truck door pocket and stood looking at those stones while steam rose from my cup. The coyote ring had taught me to listen for danger in circles. That morning, for the first time in months, I felt a different shape around me. Not safety exactly, not certainty, just the possibility that I wasn't alone in the hard part, and that whoever shared those trees understood restraint better than most men I'd known. I stood there a while longer with my coffee cooling in my hand, looking at those crossed stones like they might explain themselves if I gave them enough patience. They did not. They stayed exactly what they were, deliberate, quiet, and set where I would have to see them before anything else that day. What surprised me wasn't fear. It was relief, thin as thread, but real. Grief had been filling every corner of my head for months, and now curiosity had elbowed in beside it and asked for space. I spent the next hour doing what I always did when something made no sense. I worked. I tightened the repaired gate bolts, walked the south line, and cut 2 dead aspens that had leaned too far toward the fence. But my attention kept drifting uphill to that fir stand. Mutt stayed close, then wandered 10 yards off, then came back, never once showing the stiff-backed alert he used around coyotes. Around noon the sky dropped lower, and the wind shifted damp from the west, carrying rain smell. I checked my tarp lines over the woodpile and muttered through my list. Kindling's thin, need a dry bundle by morning. I said it to myself and to Mutt, both, same as always. That night, the coyote ring started earlier and tighter. Their calls came in patient arcs around camp, not frantic and not loud, almost conversational, like they were counting us from the dark and agreeing to wait. I fed the fire on schedule and kept the lanterns high. Mutt settled against my shin, Then after a while got up, turned in a circle near his bedroll, and lay down facing the same stand of furs as Dawn, ears loose, breathing easy. He slept through 2 long rounds of coyote calls that would have had him pacing a week earlier. I watched him and felt my own shoulders drop a notch. Dogs know what pressure is. They also know when something nearby means no harm. Rain came hard just after midnight, drumming on the porch roof and flattening the fire to a red core. I moved what I could under cover and let the storm take the rest. By first light, the downpour had gone to mist, and the whole place smelled scrubbed clean. Wet bark, creekstone, mud, and cold iron from my tools. I stepped out to assess damage and stopped dead by the woodpile. Under my tarp, stacked in a neat dry crib I had not made, sat enough finger-thick kindling for 2 nights, all of it cut to near uniform length. Bark turned inward like someone who understood airflow had built it. I said a word my father would have corrected, then laughed once because there was nobody there to hear me but Mutt. "Well," I told him, "I've either got helpful timber ghosts or I'm sleep building in the rain." Mutt sniffed the stack, sneezed, and gave the trees a quick look before he sat down by my boot. No hackles, no anxiety, just acceptance. I crouched and checked details. Fresh cuts, not axe-chopped rough, more like twisted and snapped from dry fall than trimmed by hand. No boot tracks near the pile, no drag marks. On the far edge of camp, though, I found those broad impressions again in soft mud where runoff had pooled. Same pattern as before, set wide, deep and careful, tracing the perimeter and turning away before my porch steps. The track line passed the truck, the shed, and Mutt's water pan without crossing into our center space. Whatever was moving around us could have come right up to the door. It hadn't. By the second day after the stones appeared, I had run through every practical explanation enough times to wear grooves in my own patience. Neighbor prank. Except Cal lived 40 minutes down rough road and hated driving at night. Poacher cutting through. Except poachers don't leave free fire prep for a man and his old dog. Misread bear sign. Except bears don't make a clean biped stride and then stop politely at the edge of camp. Each explanation worked for one clue and failed on the next. The pattern kept pointing in one direction I had no training for. Intent without intrusion. Late that afternoon, while checking the lower drawer for washout, I found an old wire snare anchored to a bent alder, hidden low in brush where rabbit trails crossed. I hadn't set it. My father wouldn't have either. He called snare lines lazy and cruel, long before laws tightened up. The loop had been sprung, but not with the violent twist you see when an animal panics. The wire was opened and pinned back around the trunk in 2 tidy wraps, like someone had reset it harmless on purpose. Nearby, in damp silt, I caught small rabbit tracks leading in and then bounding out, straight and quick. No churn, no struggle sign. I stood there in drizzle, hat brim dripping, and felt that same odd mixture of disbelief and gratitude move through me again. Whatever circled this place understood traps and had chosen mercy. Back at camp, I dried my hands, turned on the old handheld radio I kept for weather updates, and called Cal on the ranch frequency. "You awake over there?" I said. Static crackled. Then his voice came through, half amused already. "Bo West, alive and muttering. Must be Tuesday. You flood out?" "Not yet. Listen, you been up near my ridge at night?" He snorted. "Nope. I like my axle where it is. Why?" "I've got big tracks at my perimeter. Stone markers by my wood. Dry kindling stacked in a storm. Somebody opened a snare and let a rabbit out." There was a pause. Then he said, "You're seeing elk shadows and lonely nights, buddy. Storm week does that. Big tracks are mud spread. Kindling could be your own pile shifted." I know what my own pile looks like, I said, quieter than I felt. And I know the difference between elk and footprints bigger than a shovel. He let that sit, then came back softer. All right, keep your fire up. Keep Mutt close. I'll check in tomorrow evening. That works, I said. Appreciate it. Bo? Yeah? Get some sleep if you can. The radio clicked off. No argument, no lecture, just that familiar small-town blend of skepticism and concern. I set the handset down and wrote the call in my notebook so I wouldn't start doubting my own memory later. Cal contacted, dismissive, but checking in. Then I added, snare opened without harm. I paused, pen tip on paper, and finished the thought I hadn't wanted to admit. Whatever it is, it keeps choosing gentleness. 3 days passed in that strange new rhythm. I worked fence, cleared brush, and split wood while the coyotes kept their patient circles at night. They didn't press all the way in, but they stayed close enough to keep my nerves tuned high. Between their calls came other signs, a line of those broad prints after rain, always at the edge. A bundle of dry cedar bark left by the fire ring one morning, right where wet tinder had failed me the evening before. Mutt sleeping each night facing the firs like he trusted a watchman I couldn't quite see. My grief didn't vanish, but it lost its monopoly. I found myself looking outward more than inward, listening with attention instead of dread. On the 4th evening, cloud cover finally broke, and the light stretched long and copper through the willow draw west of camp. I took the loppers and headed down to clear branches off the old footpath to the spring, mostly to stay busy until full dark. The draw held that late autumn smell of wet leaves and cold water, with willow stems clicking together in the breeze. Deadfall lay thick from last winter's storms, brittle on top and slick beneath. I moved slowly, testing each step. Halfway to the spring, Mutt stopped behind me and gave one low woof, not alarmed, just announcing. I turned toward the fir line uphill and saw movement where shadow met light. At first, my brain tried to break it into known pieces. Trunk sway, elk shoulder, trick of dusk. Then the figure stepped clear between 2 trees, and none of those explanations held. He was enormous, 8 feet at least, maybe more, though scale gets slippery when your heart starts hammering. Dark fur, deep brown to black, where the last light hit it, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that made the fir trunks look narrow. But what struck me harder than size was control. He placed each foot around snapped branches instead of through them, shifting weight slow and deliberate so nothing cracked loud under him. The loudest sound in that whole draw was my breathing. I froze with the loppers hanging at my side. Every old survival instinct lit up and then stalled, because nothing in his posture read like threat. He did not square up. He did not rush. He angled broadside at a distance, body low and open, hands visible as if giving me room to understand what I was seeing. Mutt stood by my left knee, tail down but loose, watching steady. No growl, no retreat. I remember thinking, this can't be real, and then immediately knowing that line was a waste of time. Real was the willow smell, the cold mud soaking my boot seam, the ache in my knuckles from gripping too hard, and that giant patient presence 30 yards off, treating my fear like something to honor, not exploit. He shifted once, stepped toward a small gap in brush near the edge of Camp Trail, and bent with astonishing care for something that size. From under one arm he set down a bundle of choked cherry branches, straight cut and tied with a strip of peeled bark. Then he backed one pace, looked toward Mutt, then toward me. His eyes caught the last gold light, amber brown, steady, unreadable in the way wild things are unreadable, but calm, clear through. I did a foolish, human thing and spoke because silence felt too big to hold. "Thank you," I said, voice rough. He held still for one breath more, then turned uphill. No crash through brush, no display. Just that same measured stepping around deadfall, each movement careful, almost considerate, until shadow folded him back into the furs, and he was gone. I stayed where I was long enough for my legs to remember their job. Mutt sat down first, like this part was done, and looked up at me with a face that said I was late to understanding something obvious. I walked to the bundle on shaky knees and knelt. The branches were fresh, berry stems trimmed clean, wood dry and straight. My father used chokecherry in the smoker for venison when he wanted a mild, sweet edge to the meat. Eli used to whittle forked chokecherry sticks for slingshots on summer visits, proud as a king when he found a perfect Y. I carried the bundle back to camp like it was breakable. At the fire ring, I laid it by the kindling stack and sat on the porch step with both hands around a tin cup gone cold. The coyotes started up again after dark, but farther out that night, their ring wider, less sure. Mutt curled by his bedroll facing the fur stand and slept deep before midnight. I watched flames settle to coals and felt something in me loosen that had been clenched since my father's hospital room, maybe longer. I didn't need a theory right then. I needed to admit what had happened. Something vast had seen me, seen my old dog, seen the pressure closing in every night, and answered with restraint so deliberate it felt like a form of care. I wrote only one line in the notebook before turning in, because anything more would have sounded like I was trying to prove it to somebody. First sighting at Willow Draw. Huge, gentle, kept distance, left chokecherry bundle, withdrew. I capped the pen and held it in my fist for a long minute, listening to the scratch of coyotes moving somewhere past the east fence. The calls were thinner than the night before, but they were there, patient and organized, like men running a line in the dark without speaking. I fed one more split into the coals, checked Mutt's blanket, and lay down in my bag, with my boots still on. Sleep came, but it came in shallow strips. Each time I woke, I saw the same things in the same order. Porch post, lantern hook, Mutt's ribs rising slow, and beyond all of it the black cut of fir trunks where I had seen him step away. My mind kept trying to file what happened into a known drawer. Bear encounter, stress response, low blood sugar and bad light. I told myself this couldn't be real, then heard my own words from the drawer, "Thank you," and felt foolish for arguing with evidence I had watched with open eyes. At some point near dawn, the coyote calls drifted uphill and broke apart. I must have slept hard for an hour after that, because I woke to pale light and a stiff neck, and Mutt pressing his nose into my shoulder like he was clocking me in. The clearing looked ordinary, which somehow made it stranger. Smoke pipe, tool bucket, boot prints I knew were mine. Chokecherry bundle by the ring where I had set it. I made coffee and stood with the tin cup warming both hands, staring at that bundle until steam stopped rising. The bark tie around it was peeled clean and wrapped with a neat half hitch I'd seen old-timers use on hay twine. Not fancy, not random either. I carried it to the chopping block and sorted it branch by branch. Most were wrist-thick, dry at the core, just right for smoking meat if a man had meat worth smoking. A few had forked tops where Eli would have gone hunting for slingshot shapes when he was little. That hit harder than I expected. I sat on the block and rolled one forked stick in my palm, hearing him at 8 years old saying, "Dad, this one's got good aim. This one's for bottles," with that certainty kids have before the world teaches them caution. Mutt walked to the fir edge, sat, and watched. Relaxed ears, loose tail. He looked the way he used to look at my father's truck, pulling in after feed runs. Not excited, just settled by the fact of somebody dependable showing up. "Yeah," I said to him. "I see it too." By mid-morning, the sky cleared to a washed blue, and I worked the North Run because my hands needed tasks more than my head needed theories. I replaced 3 cracked stays, retensioned a sagging section by the old ash stump, and cleared bramble from the corner where snow always drifted deep. Every half hour, I checked the tree line without meaning to. I never caught movement, but I caught signs of attention. One fresh print in damp loam beyond the clearing, the depth of it telling me weight, the placement telling me care. He moved where he could see camp and still leave me room. Around noon, I did something I would have mocked in any other man. I set half my jerky ration on a flat stump near the perimeter, stepped back 6 paces, and stood there with my hat in my hand, feeling like a fool at a church potluck with no congregation. "If that's rude," I said to the trees, "you can ignore it." 35 years of practical habits told me not to assign intention to what I didn't understand. But another part of me, maybe the part that had been too tired to ask for help for too long, recognized pattern. Stones set where I'd notice. Kindling before rain. Snare opened clean. Chokecherry brought and left. Distance respected every time. That wasn't random movement. That was choice. I spent the afternoon mending the lean-to on the east side of the shed. While I worked, 2 mule deer stepped out of alder 20 yards downslope, fed for a while, then lifted their heads in unison toward the fur stand. They didn't bolt, they didn't flag and run. They just watched, chewed, and returned to grazing with the easy rhythm of animals that don't feel hunted. Mutt barely glanced at them. He was still aimed uphill like he was sharing a shift with someone I couldn't quite see. By the second evening after the draw encounter, my fear had thinned into something more nuanced, a tight braid of awe, caution, and gratitude. The coyote calls started at dusk, lower and closer than the previous night, and my chest tightened on instinct. I built the fire higher, set the lantern by Mutt's bedroll, and checked my shotgun again, still unloaded. Not because I wanted a fight, because routines kept panic from grabbing the wheel. Cal came over the radio just after full dark, as promised. "You upright over there?" he asked. "Still upright." "You sound tired." "I am tired." Static hissed a little, then he said, "You still seeing what you were seeing?" I watched sparks climb and vanish. "I saw him clear last night," I said, "in the willow draw, big as a barn door and gentler than most men. Left me chokecherry and walked off." Cal exhaled into the mic, long and doubtful but not mocking. "Bo, I know what I'm saying. You want me to come up tomorrow? 2 sets of eyes, maybe settle your head?" I considered it. I pictured boots, truck noise, questions, the whole fragile pattern collapsing into performance. "No," I said. "Not tomorrow. I need one more night to watch this clean." He let that sit. "All right. I don't buy your mountain giant, but I buy that you're not a liar. Keep that fire fed. Keep your dog close. Holler if it turns bad." "It hasn't turned bad yet," I said. "That's the strange part." "Then maybe let strange be strange," he said, and signed off. His disbelief didn't cut me the way it would have a week earlier. I wasn't trying to win anybody over now. I was trying to stay honest with what I had seen and with what I had not seen. No posturing, no rush, just attention. The moon rose late, bright enough to silver the fence wire and put clean edges on every stump and post. The coyote ring tightened as the night deepened. I could track them by sound and by brief motion at the edge of lantern spill. A shoulder slipping between brush, a tail low, a pair moving in tandem, then fading back. They held 30, 40 yards out and kept circling, pressure without contact. Mutt started trembling around 10. Not whining, just shaking through his shoulders and pressing behind my calves like he had the first bad nights. I knelt and put both hands on him. "I got you," I whispered. "I got you, old man." The lie in that sentence burned a little because I wasn't sure I did. The ring came closer near midnight. Calls overlapped from 3 directions now, and I heard paws on gravel by the lower wash. Firelight makes everything beyond it look farther than it is. I fed 2 splits at once and stood up, hatchet in one hand, feeling very small in that circle of orange light and black trees. My breath came too fast. I tasted metal at the back of my tongue. Then Mutt stopped shaking, not gradually. He just went still, ears lifting toward the granite shelf above the willow drawer. I followed his gaze and saw a shape detach from shadow 30 yards out, exactly where moonlight touched the rock. He stepped into that light without hurry, broadside to camp, shoulders turned so I could see his hands open and empty. The scale of him against that shelf made my mind wobble for half a beat, but there was no aggression in him at all. He stood like a man trying not to crowd a skittish horse. The coyotes kept moving for 3 or 4 breaths, uncertain now, ring-warping around this new center point. He raised his head slightly and let out a long tone that rolled through the trees like a low cedar flute. Not loud, just resonant, rising at the end and falling soft. It wasn't a bark, wasn't a challenge call, wasn't anything I had a name for. A coyote answered from the west with a sharp yip-yowl pair, and he answered back with another long note, this one curved differently, matching their cadence without copying it. Call and answer. Not attack, not chase. Conversation. I stood there with my hatchet hanging useless at my side, tears already stinging for reasons I could not yet untangle. He gave a 3rd call, then a 4th, each measured, spaced, patient. The coyote ring began to fracture. 2 peeled uphill first, trotting with heads lower than before. Another pair slipped east through brush. No rush, no panic. A single coyote paused at the edge of firelight, looked toward him, then turned and followed the others. Within minutes, the circling cadence broke into scattered, distant notes, then into nothing but wind moving through fir needles. He had not dominated them. He had redirected them. Silence landed hard after that. So complete, I heard the pop of sap in the nearest log and Mutt's slow breath against my shin. I felt something crack open in my chest that had been locked tight since Dad's funeral, and maybe since long before that. I sat down on the dirt, right where I stood, and cried without trying to hide it. Shoulders shaking, face in my hands, fire warming one side of me while cold moonlight touched the other. I cried for my father, for my marriage, for every text to Eli that sat unanswered, for all the ways I had measured my worth by output and still come up short. But mostly, I cried because an enormous wild being had looked at my fear and my old dog's trembling and answered with care so precise it left no room for denial. When I could breathe right again, I looked up. He was still on the granite shelf, watching. Not looming, not claiming anything. Just present. "Thank you," I said again, voice cracked and small in the open night. "For him. For tonight." He held my gaze. His eyes caught the edge of firelight, amber brown and steady, and I had the clear sense he was not afraid of me either. Cautious, yes. Aware, absolutely. But not fearful. We were 2 creatures in the same clearing who had both chosen restraint long enough for trust to appear. He stepped down from the shelf and moved along the perimeter with that same deliberate care, circling to the side of camp where Mutt's bedroll lay. Every muscle in me tensed, then eased as he stopped short of the lantern glow, bent and set something on the ground. A smooth river stone, pale in the moonlight, wrapped with a braid of dry grass tied clean at the center. He placed it beside the bedroll, not touching it, then straightened and looked once toward Mutt. Mutt wagged his tail twice against the dirt and stayed where he was. No ceremony followed. He turned toward the firs, stepped around deadfall I would have tripped on in daylight, and folded into shadow until only trees remained. I waited a long time before moving. Not from fear now, but from a kind of reverence I had no training for. The fire dropped to coals. Frost began to silver the tarp edge. At last I walked to Mutt's bedroll and knelt by the gift. The stone was creak-smooth, oval, fitting my palm as if chosen for a hand to hold. The grass braid smelled sun-dried and clean, not from this ridge, likely from Lower Meadow. Another deliberate choice. I did not chase him. I did not call out. Some things are damaged by pursuit. I placed the stone on the porch rail while the sky began to pale in the east. Then I opened my notebook and wrote with shaking fingers, careful and plain so I would not inflate a single detail later. Moon high. Coyote ring closed to firelight. Mutt trembling. He stepped to granite shelf, broadside, open posture. Long melodic calls, matched cadence, no aggression. Coyotes withdrew uphill in groups. Left Riverstone wrapped in dry grass by Mutt's bedroll. Withdrew to firs. Under that, after a long pause, I wrote one more line. Kindness can be large enough to hear coming and gentle enough to sing back. I stared at that sentence until the letters blurred. Then I set the notebook on my knee and pressed both hands over my face like I could hold myself together by force. The fire had dropped to a low red bed and the cold was coming up through the dirt, but I barely felt either. What I felt was the long strain of months giving way all at once. Not in a clean line, more like a rope that had frayed fibre by fibre and finally parted under a light pull. I had been braced for so long, I forgot what unbraced felt like. Mutt leaned his shoulder against my shin and stayed there, steady and warm and old, and that simple weight was enough to break me open again. I cried quieter this time, not the hard shaking from a few minutes earlier, just tears I let happen because I was too tired to stop them. I thought about my father at the kitchen table in his flannel shirt, turning a coffee cup between his hands when he had news he didn't know how to say. I thought about signing papers in a county office that smelled like carpet glue and old toner, both of us speaking politely while a life got divided into assets and dates. I thought about Eli at 12, asking if he could hold the flashlight while I changed brake pads, and how proud he was when he guessed the right socket size before I reached for it. All those moments sat together in me with no argument left between them. Loss and love were the same rope from opposite ends. The sky in the east had turned from ink to slate by the time I could breathe without hitching. I wiped my face on my sleeve, took up the Riverstone again, and held it to my chest for a second before I realized what I was doing. It was smooth, cool, and heavier than it looked, with one flattened side that fit my palm. The dry grass wrap had been braided tight, 3 strands crossed and cinched in the middle with a small knot, precise enough to make me think of my father's hands, tying baling twine. I set it down carefully on the porch step beside my boot, then reached for the chokecherry bundle and laid that near the cabin wall where it would stay dry. I wasn't making a shrine. I was putting tools where they belonged. Still, the care and the motion mattered. There's a part of me that still thinks in present tense when things get too big to fit into memory. I am sitting here in cold dawn light with smoke in my coat and tears drying on my face. I am a man who fixes broken systems, and none of my systems have language for this. I told myself this couldn't be real, and then I watched it answer danger without force. I wanted to run, but something made me stay, and now staying has changed shape. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. That certainty came from Mutt's calm, from the distance kept, from every sign of restraint. Whatever watched this clearing chose gentleness again and again. If I deny that now, I'm not being rational. I'm being afraid of wonder. When I finally stood, my knees complained and my back popped twice like old timber. Mutt followed me to the fire ring while I stirred coals and added 2 smaller splits, more for light than heat. The coyotes were gone. Not quiet, gone. No pacing at the edge, no paired movement in brush, no thin yips from the lower draw. The absence felt wide and clean. I looked toward the granite shelf where he had stood, and in the paling light I could still make out the dark shape of that ledge against the firs. No movement there now, just stone, frost, and a few bent grass stems shining silver. By full sunrise, a jay started up from the ash snag by the shed, loud and rude, like he was offended at everyone's silence. 2 chickadees answered from the creekside, then crows, then squirrel chatter, each sound returning in its normal order until the ridge sounded like itself again. I stood at the porch rail with coffee, listening to ordinary morning noise like it was the best thing I'd heard in years. Mutt ate half his ration, drank, and then stretched out in the weak sun with his head on his paws, facing the fir stand out of habit, not tension. His ears stayed loose. He dozed. I didn't realize how much that would mean to me until I saw it. At 8, I turned on the handheld and called Cal because he had asked for a check-in, and because promises should still count for something. He answered on the second crackle. "You there, Bo?" "I'm here." "You sound better. How'd the night go?" I watched steam lift from my cup and disappear. Ring closed into firelight around midnight. Then it broke and moved off. Haven't heard a single coyote since. "That's so." He paused, then added careful. "And your big fella?" He showed. Same distance, same calm. Called to them till they peeled away. Static hummed between us. "You hurt?" "No." "Mutt, okay?" "He's sleeping in the sun." Another pause. Longer this time. "All right. I still don't know what to make of your story." "You don't have to make anything of it," I said. "Just know we're fine." He exhaled. "Fine works for me. You need feed, propane? Anything hold up?" "Not today." "Copy that. Check in tonight anyhow." "I will." He signed off without jokes. That was his way of respecting a boundary he couldn't cross. After the call, I did what men like me do when the ground under our thinking shifts. I made a plan. I took a clean cigar box from the pantry shelf, lined it with an old shop rag, and put 3 things inside. 1 crossed stone photo from my phone printed on the little cabin printer Dad used for invoices, a short length of the grass braid that had frayed loose at the knot, and a penciled note with date, time, weather, and what I saw. The river stone I did not box. That stayed on the porch rail where my hand could find it. The chokecherry bundle I hung from a nail under eave shade, same as I'd hang drying herbs, because it was useful, and I intended to use it. Evidence didn't have to be shouted to be respected. I spent the next couple of hours walking the perimeter in slow loops, not hunting for him, just reading what the ground offered. Near the granite shelf, I found 1 clear impression in damp soil at the edge of a moss patch. Deep through the heel, 4 foot broad, angle turned uphill. 30 inches beyond it, another, then another, each step placed to avoid brittle branches. Past that, nothing on the needle bed. No broken saplings, no torn brush, no sign of hurry. The line of travel said what his leaving had already said. He was done here for now. He had stepped in, answered what needed answering, and stepped back out without taking up more space than necessary. That simple fact hit me harder than another sighting would have. So much of my life had been people staying too long in anger or leaving too early in silence. What he did was neither. He arrived with intention acted and withdrew when pressure passed. No claim staked, no demand made, no lesson hammered home. Just a kind of dignified mercy that left room for me to stand on my own feet afterward. The resulting calm wasn't excitement, it was steadiness. And steadiness was the one thing I had been missing. Around noon, I carried the old wire snare from the lower drawer back to camp with leather gloves and side cutters. I clipped it in 3 places, coiled the pieces, and dropped them in the scrap bucket by the shed. Then I wrote that down too. Snare removed and destroyed. I didn't want that trap ever taking another rabbit, and I didn't want to pretend someone else would handle it. Mutt watched from the porch, tail thumping once when I looked up. I told him, "That one's off the list," and he blinked like we had closed a work order together. The afternoon passed in plain chores, and plain chores felt good. I rechecked tension on the north fence, hauled 2 armloads of split pine to the stack, and patched a gap in the shed roof, flashing before weather turned again. Each task landed cleanly, one after another, without the old static in my head. Now and then, I glanced toward the fir stand. I saw only trees and shadow and a hawk riding a thermal over the ridge. That was enough. Wonder did not require constant proof to remain true. Late light turned the clearing honey-coloured, then amber, then thin blue at the edges. I built a smaller fire than usual, and sat with my back against the porch post while Mutt chewed a strip of jerky like he had all evening in the world. He looked older than he had last summer, and younger than he had 2 nights ago. I reached down and rubbed the scar patch at his shoulder where he'd tangled with barbed wire years back. "You did good," I told him. "You trusted what I couldn't." He gave me a slow blink and settled deeper into his blanket. When darkness came, it came quiet. Not empty, just quiet in the ordinary way, with owls farther up the drainage and the creek speaking to stones below the meadow. No ring of patient feet, no tightening arc. I felt the old habit rise in me, the urge to keep feeding the fire high every 12 minutes, to hold the line against a threat that had become my whole map for survival. I let that habit pass. I added 1 split, then another an hour later, and let the flames stay low. Before turning in, I picked up the riverstone from the rail and held it a long moment in both hands. The grass smelled faintly sweet and dry, summer trapped inside late autumn. I set it beside my bedroll where I could touch it in the night if I woke sharp from a dream. Then I opened the notebook one more time and wrote in plain block letters so my morning self couldn't misread it. Contact with Cal. Complete. Coyotes gone. Mutt calm. Evidence stored. No pursuit. I sat listening to the cooling tick of the lantern, and for the first time since I drove up that mountain, I did not feel like a man waiting to fail someone. I felt like a man who had been answered, wordlessly, and trusted with what to do next. I slept through till daylight with one hand on that riverstone, and when I woke, I didn't feel fixed, just aligned. There's a difference. Fixed means the old cracks vanish. Aligned means the load sits where you can carry it. I made coffee, fed Mutt, and sat on the porch step with the notebook open across my knee. I read every entry from the first night of the coyote ring to the line I wrote before bed. Then I added one more, slow and careful. No new sign overnight. Normal bird order at dawn. Dog restful. I underlined restful twice. The ridge looked like any ridge in November. Thin sun, frost in shade, smoke drifting from my own stovepipe. But I moved through it with less urgency, like my body had finally accepted that not every silence was a warning. By mid-morning, I pulled the cigar box back out and did inventory like I was closing a work ticket. 1 printed photo of the crossed stones. 1 grass braid fragment from the riverstone knot. 1 note card with date, weather, and observations in block letters. I added 2 more things: a photo of the snare after I clipped it and a copy of the notebook page with Cal's radio check logged. Then I wrote on the inside lid, "Evidence retained for personal record. Not submitted. Reason: no active threat, no trespass damage, no intent to publicize location." I wasn't hiding a crime. I was protecting a boundary. Whatever had happened there carried trust in it, and I didn't intend to repay that with spectacle. Just after noon, I drove the truck down to the county office with Mutt on the bench seat and the legal envelope beside him, creased from too much handling. The clerk remembered me from probate and slid the form across without ceremony. "Decision deadline's still spring," she said, tapping the line with her pen. "You don't have to file today." "I know," I said. "I'm filing today." She looked up then, one of those quick human checks to see if you're acting from panic. "You sure?" "I'm sure." I signed where she pointed. Keep property. Primary residence deferred. Seasonal occupancy immediate. Payment plan attached for back taxes. My handwriting looked steadier than it had any right to. She stamped the page, handed me a carbon copy, and said, "You're all set, Mr. West." That simple phrase landed heavier than she knew. Outside, I sat in the truck with the heater idling and the stamped paper on my lap, and I felt my father's place move from burden to commitment in the span of one signature. On the way back up, I stopped at Cal's place because his stock trailer was in the drive, and I could see him at the barn gate. He came over wiping his hands on a feed sack, gave Mutt a scratch through the open window, and leaned on my door. "You look like you slept," he said. I did. He studied me for a beat, then jerked his chin toward the ridge. "Ring gone?" "Gone." He nodded once, not skeptical this time, not convinced either, just attentive. "Grandad used to talk about a big watcher up high," he said, eyes on Mutt more than me. "Said if you treated the mountain respectful, sometimes the mountain treated you the same. I always figured he was dressing up old age." He gave a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Maybe he wasn't. That was the unfinished sentence between us. Finally finished. I didn't ask for more. He didn't offer folklore. He just said, "You need hay bales for windbreak. I got extras." And I said, "I'll take 4 and pay you cash, Friday." Ordinary terms, solid ground. Before I pulled out, he added, "I'm still not telling folks your story for you." I told him, "I'm not telling it for me either." That settled the last of our radio thread business better than any argument could. By the first week of November, I had the north fence fully tensioned and a 3-sided winter shelter framed off the shed with scavenged tin and fresh posts. Cal hauled the bales up in his trailer and we set them shoulder to shoulder along the windward side, while Mutt supervised from the porch like a retired foreman. We worked mostly in silence, with the kind of short job talk men use when they trust each other enough not to perform. "Lift your end. Got it. Post is plumb now. Drive it." At lunch, sitting on tailgates with thermos coffee, Cal glanced toward the fur stand and said, "You seen him again?" I shook my head. He took that in and nodded. "Maybe once was the assignment," he said. It was a strange sentence from him, and a true one. I never saw him again, and I noted that plain in the notebook that evening. No reappearance. Signs ended after intervention night. Mystery remains. I did not feel abandoned. I felt released. I called Rick at the shop that same night from the porch, watching my breath fog in the lantern light. He answered on second ring over the rattle of an impact gun in the background. "West, you alive up there?" "Alive," I said. "I can come back Mondays through Thursdays starting next week. Need Fridays and weekends for the homestead till snow sets." He didn't pause long. "We can work with that. Bay 3 misses you." "I had a rough patch," I said. "I know," he replied. "You sound less cooked now." That was Rick's version of care, and it worked for me. We set the schedule in 12 practical sentences and hung up. Another thread tied off. 3 days later, with the first hard freeze silvering every fence wire, Eli answered a text for the first time in weeks. It was only 4 words. What kind of carb kit? But I read it twice before replying, then set the phone down so I wouldn't flood him. I wrote back, Cahin rebuild. Also building winter shelter at Grandpa's. Need a second set of hands Saturday if you want shop time outdoors. No speeches, no guilt, no apology paragraph. An hour passed before his response came. I can come noon. Saturday, he climbed out of his mother's SUV in a black hoodie and work boots too clean for mountain mud. He gave Mutt a cautious pat, nodded at me and said, "Hey." I said, "Hey, kid," and handed him gloves and a tape measure. We started with a job because jobs are easier than feelings when you're both raw. Measure from that post to the corner brace. Like inside edge or center. Center, always center for span. He crouched, sighted the tape, called out numbers, and wrote them on scrap cardboard. We cut 2 braces, set one wrong, laughed when it bound against the roofline and reset it right. After a while, he loosened up enough to tell me about a science teacher who graded like a prison warden, and a friend who had blown a bike chain trying to jump a drainage ditch. I listened without turning every sentence into a fatherly correction. That restraint was new for me and overdue. When we took a break, he sat on the porch rail near the river stone, turning it in his hands. "This from the creek?" he asked. "Not our creek," I said. "Found it by Mutt's bedroll." He looked at the grass wrap, thumb tracing the knot. "Who tied that?" I took a breath and gave him the truth in the size he could carry. "Something on this mountain helped us one night when coyotes got bold. Big animal, gentle, kept distance, left signs like this." He waited for me to grin and call it a joke. I didn't. He glanced at Mutt, asleep in sun, then back at the firs, then at me. "You serious?" "Yeah." He nodded once, slow. "Okay." Then, after a minute, "Can we keep working?" "Yep," I said. "Hand me the drill." That was belief enough. He didn't need a lecture or a photo deck. He needed a day where his dad was steady and useful, and not trying to force closeness. We finished the shelter before dusk, then lit a small fire and smoked 2 chicken halves over choke cherry wood from the bundle. Eli noticed the scent right away. "Sweet smoke," he said, tearing a piece and blowing on it. "Your grandpa used this for venison." He smiled without looking at me. I remember. By the second Saturday in December, the visits were no longer tentative. Eli came up with a list in his pocket. Mini bike carb, chain tension, patch the coop door even though we had no chickens yet, and we moved through it shoulder to shoulder. He texted midweek now, short and practical. "You got 10mm socket set there? Can we wire lights and shelter next time?" That was our language returning. Not dramatic reconciliation, just repeated work where trust could regrow in plain sight. I kept every promise I made him. If I said noon, I was at the gate by noon. If I said I'd order parts, parts were on the bench. I stopped trying to win back years in one speech. The prevailing lesson from that night on the granite shelf held in every part of my life afterward. Do the needed thing. Don't crowd. Stay kind. Leave room. Winter settled in hard by New Year's, and the homestead held. Fence lines stayed upright. The shelter blocked wind clean. Mutt slept deep most nights with his nose pointed toward the firs out of old habit and quiet comfort. The cigar box stayed on the pantry shelf, labeled and closed. I never sent its contents to a lab, never posted photos, never invited curiosity seekers. The notebook remained my record, complete through season's turn, including the line that no further signs appeared. Mystery preserved, facts retained. I'm still a mechanic. I still trust torque specs, fuel pressure, and what I can measure with a straight edge. I still think most stories get bigger in the telling, but I no longer confuse skepticism with refusal. Out on that ridge, I learned a broader framework than the one I carried up there. The world is practical and strange at the same time, and those truths don't cancel each other. Something vast answered when danger circled my fire, protected an old dog without demand, and left me with work to do instead of fear to feed. I kept the homestead. I kept showing up for my son in ways he could use. I kept that river stone by the porch door, and before every drive back down the mountain, I took a moment with my hand on it, not as superstition, just as remembrance. Kindness can be wordless. It can be disciplined. It can stand at the edge of your light, sing trouble away, and leave you more responsible for the life you have than you were the night before.